system. It's not the arrival of 200 tanks or 500 tanks that are going to make any difference. It's the integration of various types of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, various missile carriers, air defense, air and missile defense. For instance, there's a 30 millimeter automatic cannon linked to radar that's excellent, that's produced by Rheinmetall. I would say you'd probably need a couple of hundred of them on the battlefield just to protect yourself from all the various unmanned aerial systems. So the bottom line is, no, this isn't going to change anything.
Do the tanks have some sort of a weaponry or equipment in their skin, for lack of a better word, a lay phrase, to neutralize the weaponry that attacks them?
Well, they have what you would call active versus passive defense. An active defense system can be all sorts of things. It can be small explosives embedded in ceramic and metal tile that is applied on the outside of the tank's armor. There are different kinds of this thing. You actually can put radar on the tank itself that detects an incoming missile. All of this stuff exists. The problem is twofold. First of all, most of that active equipment only works once. In other words, once you've struck the tank once, you don't have that protection anymore. In other words, you get a direct hit.
Right.
If you strike it twice, you may get something more, but then you're essentially naked. It only gets you through a couple of initial fights. Okay. Secondly, we don't have anything right now to deal with what I would call top attack. In other words, a missile that comes in and strikes on top of the turret. This has been a threat for a long time. In other words, it comes in and it dives down on the top of the turret where the armor is thin. The Israelis are looking at a number of very innovative ways to change that can be integrated into future armored fighting vehicles.
Do the Russians have missiles that will do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, so do the Germans. And they have not released any of those. We've been working on those, and I think we have some, if they're not already fielded in the U.S. military, and they may or may not be, I don't know. They certainly are in development. These are the new threats that are changing the nature of warfare. This is what effectively robs you of your mobility on the battlefield. And it robs you of your ability to use all of this armor that historically we've relied on to come to terms with the enemy, to go right in and kill the enemy at close range. It's not going to be solved quickly. It's sort of like World War I, when suddenly people discovered machine guns, artillery, and mines, and barbed wire and trenches, and the maneuver stopped. We're in a similar conundrum. It won't last forever, and we're going to have to find a way through it. But the bottom line is we're not really prepared for it.
The head of the Wagner Group has proclaimed that Bakhmut has fallen. President Zelensky has not refuted that. It seems to me, as a layperson in the military world, 10,000 miles away, that it's safe to say that Bakhmut has fallen. Do you have any intel on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Prigozhin made a number of interesting remarks.
That's the head of the Wagner Group.
Of the Wagner Group, right. And Prigozhin said something that many of us have suspected was the case for months, but now we've had it from the horse's mouth, and I think it's probably true. And that is that Surovikin, the general that was brought in the early fall, late summer last year to change the command structure and the way the Russians were operating,
right,
decided to turn Bakhmut into what it became, a bloodbath, a meat grinder. So they were deliberately leaving Bakhmut partially surrounded, and in the hopes that more and more and more Ukrainian forces would be poured into it that could be systematically destroyed. That's the way it looked to me for a long time.
And is that the way it worked out?
Yes, absolutely. It's been brilliant for the Russians. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened to them. And one of the things that people don't understand is, well, why didn't they just cut this off and be done with it? Why aren't they doing that? Well, there's a reason. Because if your enemy comes to you, and I just described the battlefield that we're on now, which is not very favorable or friendly to large maneuver forces. So you have to infiltrate into this World War I setting. If that's what you're operating on, you're just doing what your enemy wants you to do. And I think Surovikin was the man behind that. And that's effectively what Prigozhin said. Now, they say that all but A few blocks, something like 11% of the sort of built-up area of Bakhmut is absolutely devoid of Ukrainians, but there's still some left on the edge. And you still have talk, as we talked about the last time when we put the map up. You still have talks of 80,000 troops breaking through in or around or near Bakhmut in some fashion. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but there's still a lot of talk about that. So perhaps you leave the door open one more month and let more people, essentially convert themselves into corpses by going in there.
We just interviewed Jack Devine just about a half an hour ago, and he had some comments about the Russians and Bakhmut that either will affect your blood pressure or cause you to have some fun with them. Here's what he said.
In the last 2 months, you were telling me these great wizards of war were saying the Russians have the 300,000 man army and they're going to roll right over Ukraine. Here we are, 150,000 troops went in, and they may or may not have taken a town. I mean, he is having a hard time. This is not victory. Anybody that thinks he's won something, God bless you. But I mean, I don't know how I could hold my head and invade a country and move a few kilometers, So I think he's in trouble. I think he's in serious trouble. That's why there's a fight between the regular military and the Wagner Group.
He, of course, to whom he refers is President Putin.
Well, Judge, what do you want me to say? I think Jack is entertaining to listen to, but I think he's got a severe problem with cranial rectal defilade. Thanks, Jack, for your interest in national defense. The other thing I would say is, and this is something else that people aren't paying attention to, but they should right now, the bridges over the Dnieper up in Zaporizhia and further north. These are major bridges that you can drive, 18-wheelers, tanks, anything you want across these bridges over that river. They're all intact.
Mm.
And the Russian citizenry has asked several times, why don't you destroy these and stop those Ukrainians from crossing that river? Well, the Ukrainians aren't crossing the river in very great strength anymore because they've killed most of them. They're trying to put together this big counterattack. We'll see what comes of it. I have serious doubts that it's going to amount to much. I think it's just going to get a lot of people killed. So why haven't they destroyed those bridges, Judge? Is it Jack Devine's perception that, the Russians just aren't very bright? They haven't done their battlefield assessment. They're not acting. Well, I don't agree with that. I think the Russians plan to use those bridges
themselves. I mean, what prompted the ridiculous comments from Jack was my inquiry about Bakhmut falling. And first he denied it, and then he said he had heard the rumors that it fell, and then he said it's just one little town. Well, you and I and the thousands that watch us when you're on this show looked at the map and saw how central and how critical that town is. And now you've told us that the Russian strategy has not only been to secure the town, but to use it as the jaws of death, if I may, for the Ukrainian troops that were foolish enough to be flooded into those jaws.
Well, Ukrainian commanders, we know, have begged Zelensky to let them get out. They described it exactly as it is, a meat grinder. They were just losing people. We've been through these discussions. The average lifespan for someone new to the front is 4 hours? This is insane. So I think the Ukrainians knew that. The larger issue, and Jack is basically giving you the standard narrative, and that's fine.
Right.
And everybody's doing that in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Every once in a while, a little bit of truth creeps in. But the bottom line is that no one is moving a lot anywhere until the mud goes away. And, you try to explain to Americans that this stuff is like slogging your way through 10 feet of slime that sticks everything, that stops everything. Americans can't even begin to imagine it. The only place I've seen in the United States we come close to it is in southern Texas, where you have something they call caliche. It's a real thick earth that becomes mud and does something similar. But even it pales before what we're dealing with in.
Is this unique to Ukraine? And is this possibly what makes the Ukraine earth, dirt, so fertile for growing wheat?
No, I think so. I think when you're talking about what 10 to 15 meters deep in most places, this black earth, it's very rich, that will grow anything.
Right.
Throw anything in it, it grows.
When the Ukrainian military superiors are foolish enough to send their troops into a meat grinder or the jaws of death, does American intel know about this, even military intel? And are they warned about it? Or do the Ukrainians do it anyway because of this vain effort to die fighting?
Well, now you're moving into an area where we just don't know. I mean, I'm sure some of your former intelligence officers that you've spoken to can give you a better picture. My experience is that, first of all, if you've already decided what the outcome is going to be, which is the case in Washington, that Russia is going to be defeated, humiliated, and driven east out of Ukraine forever and ultimately capitulate and give up Crimea, if you believe that, then a whole lot of things don't work well. And one of those is that you may just ignore what comes up to you that doesn't conform to your preconceived ideas. That's always been a problem. We went through that in Vietnam for years.
This morning in Moscow, President Putin addressed publicly the new U.S. ambassador to Moscow. There were other Western ambassadors there as well. And he basically blamed the war on the United States and articulated in public his view, a view you and I share, and most people watching us now share, I think, that the U.S. was responsible for the coup in Ukraine in 2014, the so-called color revolution. And the U.S. started all of this and thus is largely responsible for it. I don't know that President Putin has been that direct, that public about this before.
Well, I think he certainly made the larger case. He hasn't been specific about the so-called coup, but there's a huge mountain of evidence to support what he's saying. And by the way, you now have Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, who is absolutely convinced that we're running a quote unquote color revolution against him and his government.
Well, you're a question ahead of me as to whether, God bless you, Colonel, whether you believe that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for massive, persistent, endless demonstrations in the streets in Jerusalem and Israel over the makeup of the Israeli judiciary.
Well, you have this thing called the National Endowment for Democracy that is all over the place. And the National Endowment for Democracy should probably be renamed Color Revolution Headquarters for the subversion and installation of new governments that are subservient to, responsive to U.S. will. I mean, that was clearly going on in Kazakhstan in the first few weeks of this Ukrainian disaster. You'll recall the Russians sent a lot of special forces in there to help the government recover itself. It's been the case in any number of places. I think that's one of the reasons that Lukashenko has effectively signed on 100% for Putin, because you had the same outfit working in Minsk.
Right.
This is not new. Now, is the CIA involved with that? Of course.
Right. How else could it have happened? Well, President Putin was speaking directly into the eyes of the American ambassador in Moscow. President Zelensky was visiting one of his staunchest allies in Poland. We have a little clip there. There's the president of Poland, and there's President Zelensky. What more can the Poles give him short of troops on the ground, which we know is what he wants?
Well, now we've got another problem in the region. All of these, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of the states in Central East Europe that border Russia or are close to it in any way have agendas. We've got to remember that Poland, after World War I, regained much of its territory that it had lost in the 1790s. It would like to do the same thing again. Remember that Stalin's great gift to the Europeans was to shove millions of Germans further west then shoved millions of Poles into places that were historically German, at least for 1,000 years. And this had a wonderful effect because it forced the Germans away from Russia, but it also created in Stalin's mind permanent conditions of hostility between the Germans and the Poles for the territorial changes that he imposed on them.
Right.
Hungary lost vast territory at the end of the Second World War. The Kingdom of Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
They controlled vast lands that are now occupied by the Romanians. Some are occupied by the Serbs. Some are occupied today by Croats. Some are occupied by Slovaks. So you go back into these countries and you begin to talk to people, and just because you lost a war, just because you weren't on the winning side 100 years ago, you have to understand these people. They were dominant powers for centuries, dominant not just in economic or military terms, but also culturally, linguistically. You get the same thing when you go to Iran. You know, very few people understand that from the Chinese border all the way to the border with Russia and Ukraine, the language that was spoken on the so-called Silk Road was Persian.
All right. Well, while we're talking about cultural, are there cultural rumblings now in Kosovo?
Yes. Yeah, that's another terrible wound. It's another example of where we intervened. We created an artificial. I think it's very clear that our ammunition stocks, as well as key items of equipment, such as your self-propelled 155 millimeter gun, are in very short supply now as a result of having to supply the Ukrainians. You ask, is it dangerously low? It's only dangerous if we are contemplating a confrontation with the Russians. That is out of the question in my view. And for that matter, if we were to go back to the Middle East and take on any number of opponents there, it would be equally ill-advised. So I would say it's not dangerous unless we are stupid and decide to intervene somewhere.
Have we supplied the Ukrainian military from our surplus or from our substance?
Both. But we have had to rely increasingly on the substantive American military capabilities. There's now talk about sending even more sophisticated missiles with greater ranges, which I find disturbing because the more we do this, the more likely we are to end up in a confrontation with the Russians, for which we're completely unprepared. But there's talk about that right now in the media.
The last time we spoke, which was a day or two before Thanksgiving, we talked about whether or not there was any impetus on the part of the State Department or NATO diplomats to push President Zelensky and President Putin, to the extent they can push Putin anywhere, toward the negotiating table. In the interim, you sent me some videos, which are too horrific for us to show, which show Ukraine atrocities against captured Russian soldiers. So these are captured Russian soldiers who ought to have been protected by the Geneva Conventions. Obviously, they weren't. They were executed with bullets in the head. Why would this have happened? Why would there have been videos of it? Why would the videos of it have been displayed on Ukraine streaming sites?
Well, Judge, you're right. The videos that show Russian prisoners of war being essentially murdered after they've surrendered have been posted by Ukrainian soldiers. These are videos taken by Ukrainian soldiers and then posted on the internet, essentially as a point of pride, in the belief that they are somehow another frightening or horrifying the Russians, who knows. But I also think there's another sinister dimension to this. I think there's an interest in Ukraine, particularly in Kiev, to ensure that there can be no negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. Not so much because of people in Kiev that might be willing to talk, but I think there's growing fear that Washington will ultimately abandon them. They know that Ukraine fatigue is not exclusive to Europe. Ukraine fatigue is certainly having an impact inside the United States. They can read the news. They know that the new Republican Congress may well turn out to be much less willing to support them than the previous one. So under the circumstances, I think they want to make it almost impossible. And one way you do that is by murdering your opponent's soldiers and then posting videos about it, because it so poisons the waters, if you will, with Russia. And it makes it so difficult for the Russians, particularly President Putin, to come to any arrangement, because the Russian people are seeing these things and are incensed. You have Russian military commanders, and frankly, you know, from the beginning, we've accused the Russians of terrible things. They did not do those things. They did not mass rape. They did not mass murder. That's all nonsense. It's all propaganda that the Ukrainians cooked up and then was disseminated across the West and eagerly regurgitated by the Western media, but it was never
Well,
true.
I'm assuming that what you sent me was real. It certainly looked real.
It's absolutely real. There was another video in the mix, though, that was kind of entertaining because it showed what appeared to be an attempt by the Ukrainians to orchestrate a fake Russian attack on civilians. I mean, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess for us, they showed the director of the operation, lights, cameras, and supporting people.
It was
And this is being done before by the Ukrainians as well.
All right. Would the mass display of Ukraine war crimes and atrocities on captured defenseless Russian soldiers, boys, have been approved by the high command, or is this some rogue endeavor by the more hardcore of the Ukraine troops? Do you have an answer to that or an idea on that?
If this was a one-off, and then suddenly the Ukrainian government directed that these videos be removed, and then made a statement that they're going to look into this to establish the facts, and if this is in fact true, they will take action. If that had happened, then one would conclude that these were rogue elements, but that has not happened. And so the only conclusion I can reach is that people in Kiev are saying, look, this will keep the war going. This will make it harder for the United States to abandon us because the Russians won't do business. And that's what they currently think is in their interest.
I want to put on the screen a map of Ukraine, which you have seen. In fact, you were gracious enough to send it to us. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let our viewers take a moment or so to look at it. The red starbursts represent areas where there's been the concentration of Russian missiles and artillery. The blue represent areas of blackouts where there's no electricity or water to speak of. In the sort of lower right of this portion of Ukraine, the striped area represents the area that has been under Russia's control for a while. So let me start going all the way west. Are you surprised that the Russians sent their missiles all the way west? Well, what is the next country over there west? Forgive my ignorance.
Well, west from the map that you're looking at right now, where you see Lvov, just west of that 20 miles is the Polish border.
Wow. Is it reckless for the Russians to send their missiles so close to the Polish border? Is that a lesson to NATO?
No, it's not reckless at all. First of all, to understand what's happening now, this is very similar to what the United States did in Iraq, to what it did to the Serbs during the Balkan campaigns, the Kosovo Air campaign, very similar to what we did during World War II to Germany and Japan. We systematically identified the networks, the infrastructure for fuel storage, fuel distribution, and today power plants on a grand scale. We did that. We destroyed those places and essentially put countries in the dark and did exactly what you're describing, made it impossible for them to effectively lead normal lives. That was part of the plan. It worked very effectively in Germany. I mean, we were so effective against the fuel refining, storage, and distribution that it brought the Air Force and the Army almost to a standstill in Germany in 1945, certainly by the end of 44. So that's what we're doing now, and this is long overdue. And this is part of the larger plan to prepare Ukraine for the coming offensives. I mean, why would you let your opponent lead a comfortable, leisurely existence if you plan to attack him on a grand scale on the ground?
Right.
And see, before, when this first phase, no one ever completely grasped what Moscow wanted. They wanted an arrangement. They wanted a negotiated settlement. They were not interested in destroying the country. They didn't want to kill large numbers of people. By the middle of the summer, it was clear that's not going to work. So they threw those assumptions out. They went on to essentially a strategic defense, an economy of force mission. Let's use as few forces as possible to hold on to what's ours, and then we'll build up for the offensive. And that's what's been going on. Now it's getting cold finally. So perhaps in 3, 4, 5 weeks or something, we'll see a major offensive.
Gary, can you put the map up again? Colonel, I want to ask you about the sort of lower right-hand portion, if you will,
Right.
where you see the gray and black stripes. Now, as I understand the symbols on the map, that reflects the portions of Ukraine which are in which Russian-speaking people live and which the
Yes.
Russian government controls.
Yes.
If I'm correct, don't I also see some red symbols there showing Putin attacking that area with either missiles or artillery? How unusual is that? There are Russians living there.
Well, let's not say Putin attacking. You know, he's in Moscow, and
Okay.
these strikes are ordered by the high command of the Russian theater and General Surovikin.
Okay,
Strike
so the generals in chief are attacking
Yeah.
where Russians live. Am I right?
Well, first of all, understand something. Today we have this capability we call strike. Strike is different from what we imagine the standard use for artillery or rockets or missiles might be in the West. The only thing that separates one strike from another is time and space. And we have precision, which means that we could literally, if we saw something in your backyard where you live, Judge, and we thought it was threatening to us, we could target it and destroy everything in your backyard without necessarily harming you. Now, we demonstrated that capability during the Kosovo air campaign. Some of your viewers will remember that the Albanians in particular were shocked at our ability to attack Serb forces that stood next to or were positioned very close to Albanian homes, but they never damaged any Albanian homes. Well, the Russians can do the same thing. And so there was a decision to attack there, ostensibly because there was some connectivity to this power generation network, and they decided to remove it. Now, beyond that, I don't know the details, but it's eminently capable. They're eminently capable of doing this with great precision. That's why striking those targets that were near the border with Poland was not reckless, because they know they can hit them with absolute precision.
Okay, Gary, put the map up again, please. So, Colonel, if the Russians can move with that much precision, then their strikes around Lviv and Kyiv, which we know destroyed residential areas, were done intentionally, that the destruction of homes and apartment buildings was not a byproduct, it was the goal. Is that fair to say?
No, again, that's not accurate, because the power stations and the power distribution networks were inside those areas. In other words, they didn't decide we just want to level Kyiv. I mean, if they wanted to level Kyiv, they could do it tomorrow morning. It would take a couple of hours. So
where on the map is the nuclear power plant or nuclear power plants?
Well, the nuclear power plant of greatest interest, of course, is the one to the south in the vicinity of Zaporozhye, which the Russians are protecting. The Ukrainians have repeatedly tried to launch missiles and rockets and artillery rounds against that power station in the hopes of precipitating a nuclear crisis that they think they would benefit from.
All right, right above Zaporozhye, it shows the symbol for an explosion. Then to the left of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for a blackout, and to the right of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for the blackout. So you're telling us that they want to isolate without destroying and prevent the use of the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye.
Yeah, well, it's not a question so much of preventing Ukrainians from using it. They are protecting that plant from Ukrainian attacks. Now, what they have done is that they have removed the connectivity, as you point out, involving the transmission of power from these plants to Ukraine. That has been done, and that will continue to be done. And we ought to pause for a minute and understand the cascading effects of these attacks. This affects everything, every part of life in Ukraine. You're not just talking about transportation and water, of course. You're also talking about rural life where you have herds of cattle, herds of sheep, vast farmlands. Now those animals and the farmland is lying fallow. The animals are dying. They're losing 20, 30% of their livestock, not because the Russians are killing them, but because they can't feed them. They can't move them. They can't sell them. They can't care for them. So the cascading effects are destroying completely the Ukrainian economy. So Ukraine's output is about non-existent now.
So December 1st is 3 days from now. There's already snow on the ground in the northern parts of Ukraine. Where do you see this going in the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, say between now and the first of the year?
Well, the experts on these matters, and I'm not one of them, that know something about the weather and about the terrain in Ukraine. I've seen some of Ukraine, but not all of it. And the Ukrainian black earth topsoil varies from 4 to 12 to 15 feet deep. It depends on where you are. That's why it's such a productive region. You have to freeze that, because if it's not thoroughly frozen, you sink like a rock, whether you're in a truck or you're in a tank. It doesn't make any difference. It's not frozen yet. It's only just now dropped below freezing on a permanent basis. Up till this point, we've had freezing at night, but during the daytime, it's gone back up into the 40s or even 50 degrees. It has to drop below freezing and stay that way for at least 2 weeks. So if it's now below freezing and it stays that way, you can do the math. You're looking for something happening no earlier than the 10th, probably no later than the 19th of December. And you're talking about concentrations of Russian troops all the way around the country. We've accounted now formally by these are the people that sit in front of your monitors that control satellites. And the intelligence community says that it's accounted for 540,000 Russian troops. Okay. And of that 540,000, we're talking about 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, of which at least 1,500 are tanks, probably another 1,000 self-propelled artillery, the rest infantry fighting vehicles, 1,000 rockets, missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, your so-called drones, unmanned attack systems, 1,000 of those systems. That doesn't even begin to address the hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft, hundreds of helicopters. The helicopters will move troops, obviously. There will be some ground support, hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft operating as close air support, and also bombers now. We've begun to see the use of bombers, which is something we've done for years. They're now beginning to do it, and they all have precision munitions.
Okay, so
which you aim at.
What you've just described must be understood and known by President Zelensky, by Ukrainian intelligence, by American intelligence, by the State Department, by the Pentagon, and by the White House.
Yes.
And what are they going to do about it?
Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ship more equipment to the Ukrainians. The problem is the Ukrainian casualties have been horrendous, particularly over the last few months. There was an article today in the Euro News. I'm told there's another one in the New York Times describing the very, very heavy casualties. Of course, the big lie that is always told to accompany the bad news is, well, the Russians have taken heavy casualties too. Nonsense. The Russians have not. And that's the difference. When you're killing your enemy at a 10-to-1 ratio, which is about where it is right now in southern Ukraine with the Russians and Ukrainians, you're not hurting at all. And the Russians, again, aren't running out of anything. The Ukrainians are running out of everything. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, you name it. Their soldiers, most of the best troops are dead or wounded. And the people that they're shoving forward in the defensive positions are untrained reservists. They say, well, that means that if we get 2 weeks of continuous freezing, there is no reason why, at least for meteorological reasons, the Russians should not launch their coming offensive. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, Bakhmut has figured prominently in everybody's calculus because it's drawn so much attention. Bakhmut is turned into something that is analogous in some ways to Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad for Zelensky. Zelensky and his friends seem to think that the loss of Bakhmut is unacceptable, would break the will of the Ukrainian people, demoralize Ukrainian forces. And so he's continued to sacrifice thousands of Ukrainian lives in that place. We now estimate 450,000 casualties thus far in the war, close to 150,000 dead.
Ooh.
And
this is both sides, 450 and 150?
No, this is the Ukrainian side.
Oh.
And if you listen to General Zaluzhny, he came on earlier today, or it could have been last night, talked about how supposedly the Russians are advancing over the bodies of their dead comrades because the Ukrainians have killed so many. The only thing I can think of is that he's channeling Baghdad Bob. If you remember when we intervened in Iraq in 2003, you had this Baghdad Bob kept coming on telling everybody about the victorious forces of Saddam Hussein throwing us back, inflicting casualties.
I remember Baghdad Bob. I tried to interview him, but he turned it down. Turned down everybody from Fox, understandably. But I'm interested in your comparison of General Zaluzhny to Baghdad Bob, of all people. I thought General Zaluzhny was the adult and was credible, not only to the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian public, but to the Russian high command.
Well, I'm not sure about the last part of you're credible to the Russians. I just don't know what they think. I doubt seriously that they hold anybody in the current regime in high esteem. Having said that, remember that Zaluzhny was actually very honest to the extent that he could be in his Economist interview, and essentially pointed out, I need a new army. I need all of this equipment. If I don't get it, I'm probably not going to be able to withstand what's coming from the Russians. But now he's back in the saddle, and he's been told to get back online and back on board. And the mantra is, we're killing Russians, by the hundreds every day. We're winning. We're doing well. But as well as I do, they're now pressing teenagers into service. We have photos of them and video coming out over various internet sites, which is tragic to say the least. 16-year-old boys.
It's not only tragic, and as you pointed out to me in some private emailing you and I did, where are the NGOs? Where are the non-government organizations that are humanitarian to prevent this? And it's probably, I don't know how old these kids were. The kids that I saw, their faces looked 14, 15, 16. It was hard to tell because they had military gear on, but they didn't shave yet. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's got to be a violation of international law and clearly European human rights, which is pretty sensitive on the use of children in the military. But beyond that, is it not telling of how desperate Zelensky is?
Well,
if he's conscripting 15 and 16-year-olds?
Of course, but to this, you've also got to add the fact that they are desperately seeking foreign fighters now. The foreign fighters are becoming very, very important to them because they just don't have experienced NCOs and officers anymore. They're bringing in raw talent with very little training. And of course, you have this man, Milburn, the retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, who came out and gave an interview and talked about how desperate the Ukrainians were. And he talked about the heavy losses and frankly, why he was pulling out his mercenary training group. So I think at this point in time, it's really up to the Russians. The initiative is passed to them. The weather is in their favor now, and there's nothing to stop them from attacking whenever they want to by the middle of January.
What is the status of the 300,000 or so, more or less, reservists called up to duty back in the fall, trained, armed, transported, ready to go? I'm assuming trained, armed, transported, and ready to go. Leave that to you to correct me.
No, I think so. Understand that I do disagree a little bit with some other analysts. Scott Ritter has argued it's going to take longer to get them ready. I think they're integrated now. As I said, they're getting the 2 weeks of freezing temperatures. There
Okay.
is no reason why they cannot attack. And everything that's been happening down in the Donbass, everything that happens with these missile strikes that go in day after day, is all about shaping the battle space, making it safe, if you will, for the maximum offensive power of the Russian army.
All right. In the interest of fairness, and because this is television, and because I like, or it's streaming, because I like to stir the pot, we from time to time have
Sure.
others on than you and Scott Ritter, even though you and
What?
Scott are
You have other people on? I'm shocked, Judge.
are our favorites. This is a person, longtime friend of mine, longtime CIA guy that our audience loves to hate. And I asked him, Jack Devine, about the 300,000 Russians. It's a long answer, but he gets around to answering it at the end. Gary, doesn't he have about 300,000 called up, uniformed, now trained reservists about to enter the theater of war? And if he does, wouldn't that overwhelm the Ukrainian forces?
He had 180,000 the last round. I mean, that's not chicken feed, right? And you looked at it. They weren't armed properly. Where did they get the new arms? Where did they get the training? How did they get so battle ready in 6 months? You're looking at Ukrainians have been fighting for almost a year now. They're as tough as nails. Their strategy, their planning. You're going to send a lot of rookies in. Do they have gas? They have logistics? 300,000. They're going to just march in. They're going to use air power. I mean, do they want to fight? We know what wars are like when people do. They went into Afghanistan. My goodness. I mean, full-blown Russian army went in and was driven off by sheep herders. And why? Because and I'll tell you firsthand, the Russian soldiers did not want to fight in Afghanistan. Are they really going to fight in Ukraine? I mean, it's like almost like a civil war, and it's unprovoked. We'll see how. Look at the Iraqi army. How many troops are in the Iraqi army, Judge? 300,000 armed by the United States. Where did they go? They went home. So size isn't the story.
All right, Colonel, I saw you chuckling on the monitor. What do you think?
Well, I
Jack
don't know.
is always going to mouth the party line. I don't know. Maybe
Right.
this would be against the law. Maybe they clip the pensions of CIA officers who've retired and failed to mouth the company line. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I don't see this man as someone who knows much about Russians or Ukrainians. His comments about Afghanistan are really very misleading. The Russian, if we go back and look at the Soviet forces that went into Afghanistan at the beginning, they were overwhelmingly Russians. They went in there and they very rapidly established themselves. Then the subsequent follow-on forces were overwhelmingly reservists that came out of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. In other words, nearby places. And frankly, these people weren't terribly interested in fighting what was there. But having said all of that, our so-called Iraqi army vanished almost overnight, whereas the Soviet-trained forces held forth for a couple of years after they left, and so did its government.
Does he have a point when he says the 300,000 don't have the will to fight? Or
No.
are these 300,000? I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about like National Guard guys who have jobs during the week and they train 1 weekend a month and two weeks a summer like here? Or are we talking about hardened professionals?
Well, first of all, unlike most of your National Guardsmen in the United States, all of these 300,000 have served inside the Russian army.
They
That's
have
very
been
important.
on active duty.
Yeah. And anywheres from 3 to 8 years. And so what they've been going through is essentially updating their training, updating them on the various modernization programs, the equipment that's available. And they've been training for winter fighting. And they've been training very, very hard. The other thing is, I don't think this man really understands anything about Russians or Ukrainians. First of all, we all know Ukrainians are tough. I grew up with them, and I know their war record. They've always been very, very fine soldiers. That's not open to debate. But it doesn't matter how good you are when you're up against overwhelming firepower and you take enormous losses, which is what's happened. On the Russian side, anybody who thinks the Russians are weak is crazy. In fact, I would say these 300,000 are not only enthusiastic about going to Ukraine. I think they have enormous backing at home inside Russia. All the words on the atrocities committed by Ukrainian forces against Russian troops have filtered out to the population, despite the fact that the Putin government has tried to clamp down on it and suppress it, largely because they're afraid of what this anger could produce in Russia against Ukraine. I totally disagree with his entire assessment.
Okay. In the midst of all of this, President Emmanuel Macron of France has weighed in. Here's what he said. I think it was on New Year's Eve. France will continue to help Ukraine, quote, without fail, and quote, until victory itself. We will build a just and durable peace together. Count on France and count on Europe. Is he talking about troops? What is he talking about, as you understand this? Or is this just political pabulum for the French press?
I think it's a combination of all the above. He's also made comments about finding a way forward that's not going to involve compelling Russia to give up all of its gains. He's already said publicly, we can't expect the Russians to give up Crimea. And he said we should have pressed ahead in the Minsk agreements and done a better job with Luhansk and Donetsk and so forth. I think it depends on which audience he's talking to and when you hear him.
All right. Here's General Stoltenberg, the commander of NATO. I call on allies to do more. It is in all our security interest to make sure Ukraine prevails and Russian President Vladimir Putin, he mentions him by name, does not win. This is pretty direct and in your face, Secretary General of NATO to President of Russia, isn't it, Colonel?
Well, let's stop and think about what he's just said. How many times did you hear FDR or any of the leading lights in the U.S. military or the government during World War II complain about the failure of the British or the Soviets to do enough? This is a trick question.
Yeah.
Never. All right?
Right.
That's nonsense. We never made those kinds of comments because they were in the fight long before we were, and they were heavily engaged. We were giving them everything we could to keep them engaged until we could bring force to bear against them. My point is, if this were a successful operation, a successful war effort, you wouldn't be begging your allies to do more. The truth of the matter is that Europeans overwhelmingly want nothing to do with this war, and their governments know it.
Is there military significance to what Secretary General Stoltenberg said? Does he command troops? Can he order troops in?
Stoltenberg is a mouthpiece for whomever governs Washington, for whomever is president of the United States, whatever the administration is. He says and does what Washington tells him to. And he can snap his fingers, he can crack his whip, but you can't create armies and forces out of nothing. It takes a long time to put people into organizations, into formations, train them, equip them. This is not something you do quickly. Frankly speaking, that's why we've been waiting for several months now, watching the Ukrainians impale themselves on Russian defenses, because the Russians are doing exactly that. They're getting ready all of these massive military formations to attack. So what if we start going down the list? And the French army is designed to conduct safaris in North Africa. The British army is smaller and less capable. You know, the United States Marine Corps is larger and better equipped and better organized to fight than most of the European forces. The Poles are now bringing up, we think, 200,000 men. I'm told they've already got 90,000 mobilized, and they're trying to get them ready so that they can build their army up, presumably to defend Poland. But I worry about other things, as we know.
Well, General, I am very concerned about Poland. You and I have discussed this. You know this better than almost anybody. There's 90,000 Poles on active duty. There's 40,000 Americans intermingling and training with them. They are just they are just west of the Poland-Ukraine border. Now you tell me that this crazy president of Poland, who thinks that somehow Crimea is going to go back to Ukraine when this is over, is about to add 250,000 more troops.
Oh, absolutely. That's
where the hair trigger could occur, in my view, that would start World War III. What do you think?
Well, here's the other thing. The Poles see themselves as a great nation that has been deprived of its opportunity to be great. They were great 400 years ago. They were powerful in Europe, the largest state in Europe, the most powerful military force in Europe 400, 500 years ago. They would really like to be that again. And so when you listen carefully to the Poles and you watch their television, they're talking about expanding Poland to regain control of territories they once governed. That's not necessarily a